Well, the best way, as I've said, to study the Bible, as I've been trying to tell you, study it book by book and to read a book right through if you can, or at least spread it over a couple days, but to read it straight through as a whole. So today we're going to look at Romans, and I'm sure this is going to be part one. The Bible is a unit or a library of books, of 66 books, and they're different kinds of books. Now, we're studying at the moment the letters, the epistles, or the letters are peculiar to the New Testament. There isn't, as far as I know, a letter in the Old Testament. They're all in the New, and most of them are by the Apostle Paul. Now, even though these letters were quite expensive and difficult to send in the olden days, we've got quite a lot of that's been dug up by archaeologists and discovered in libraries. We altogether have some 14,000 letters from those days, which, as you can certainly understand, is quite a lot. And when you compare all those letters with the ones we have in the Bible today, there are some very interesting comparisons. The average length of a letter in those days was anywhere between 18 and 209 words, and that's about the range, which is really quite short. But when somebody has to carry it for hundreds of miles, you can understand the lighter that letter is, the easier. But Paul's letters, as we see, are very much longer. There are one or two long letters from the ancient world, and I've jotted down that Cicero wrote a letter of 2,500 words, which is the longest, and a man called Seneca wrote one just over 4,000 words, which was an all-time record until the Apostle Paul comes around with his letter to the Romans. And that is 7,000 plus words. So it's the longest letter we have from the ancient world. So, in many respects, it's a special letter. His average was about 1,300, but here's one of 7,000. So we've only got two talks, and I'll try to keep them at 40 minutes and try to open it up. What I'm trying to do is give you the keys to unlock it for yourself and get the treasure out. I'm not trying to teach it for you. That's spoon feeding. I'm trying to give you the keys so that you can say, I think I will be able to read it for myself and understand what it's getting at and what the writer's intending me, you and I, to receive. Now, the letter to the Romans is also unusual for another number of other reasons, and there are a very long opening greeting in this letter, but there's even a much longer closing greeting. There's a whole chapter that's nothing but people sending their love, a whole long list. It's highly unusual to spend such a long bit of a letter just passing on greetings from friends to friends. Why does Paul do that? And then, when you read the letter, it reads more like a lecture than a letter. It's not kind of a chatty letter that you'd write to someone telling them about your wife and kids and everything going on. It's really a lecture. And it's even more than a lecture because you feel that though Paul is arguing with people, it's kind of a dialogue. He's currently quoting an objection from a heckler and then answering the objection. So, he'll say, for instance, shall we sin that grace may abound? God forbid. There's a kind of a conversation going on. So what is it all about in the book of Romans? Well, now, one of the things that sets it apart from all the other letters we've got of Paul, and he's writing to a church he's never seen, a church he didn't found or begin, a church he had no personal contact with. Now, Paul looked after his own churches very faithfully, but he didn't interfere with anyone else's work. And So what's he doing writing the longest letter of all to the church he didn't start and that he's never visited? By the way, that explains why there are so many greetings. He's trying to establish himself in their eyes and saying, I know a lot of people you know, which is what you do when you want to write to someone you don't know. You try to scrape up an acquaintance and say, well, I'm a friend of so-and-so, you know. It's kind of like when I say I'm a pastor or a preacher to an unbeliever, they usually say, oh, you know, my grandfather's gardener's wife's second cousin was in the church. And they try to scrape up some kind of connection. You get the feeling Paul's doing that in that last chapter. Well, now, he's written before he's had any personal relationship, and yet it's obvious from the letter that he wants one, that he has an ambition to meet them, to get to know them, and for them to get to know him. So why does he have this ambition? He intends to visit them. He says this. I'm hoping to come and see you, he says. So why doesn't he wait until he goes? Why send a long letter, a very long letter, before he gets there? Well, it could put them off, but he does have a real purpose in it. And now this letter is much cooler, I suppose you could say, than his others. And this is very cool. In fact, it's rather intellectual. As I've said, it's a lecture and it's presented like a lecture. There are just one or 2 points where he gets a little warmed up. But on the whole, he's very tempered. He's very cool in his letter. So it's obviously quite different from his others, and it has no hint of a crisis, no controversy going on requiring his correction. Someone has said it has no scent of battle, and I like that. In most of his letters, there's a scent of battle. He's fighting something. None of that's here. So why was it written? And that's what we always want to look at. It's perhaps a general circular letter that he just wants to circulate. It's a printed sermon. It's a tract. Then why does he address it to Rome in particular? That's a question we're going to wrestle with. And now, unfortunately, Bible scholars give us just too many answers. At least a dozen different answers have been given as to why this letter was ever written. But we can group them under 3 basic reasons. Some of them start with the writer and say the reason for writing is to be found in the writer. And we always look at the writer. Some say, oh no, the reason he's writing is to be found in both the writer and the readers and the relationship between them. And others say the reason for writing is to be found in the readers only. And these lead us to 3 really different approaches to the letter of Romans, and you'll see that in commentaries. I'm trying to give you all 3. I'll be very frank. The third reason is my favorite as far as I can understand, but let's go through the others. And under each of them, there are 2 varieties of that answer. So I'm going to give you 6. I could have given you double that number, but I'm just trying to give you 6 main ones. And this is the kind of thinking that you really need to do to get to the background of a letter, especially when it's a bit obscure like Romans. Let's start with the writer. Can we find a reason for this letter in Paul? Well, the year we know is probably about AD 55, so Jesus has been gone for 32 to 35 years. Paul's been preaching now for 20 years. He's completed his mission in the Eastern Mediterranean. He's planted a strategic, church in every major city in the Eastern Mediterranean, and we said he would do that in the book of Acts in a province, so he wanted it to ripple out. He finished his work. Now, he hasn't evangelized everybody, but he's planted a church, as I said, in every province that can do the evangelizing, so he's finished and he sets up people to continue what he's done. That was his objective. And like a good Christian, he had a goal to go for, and he knew when he'd reached it. But you see, it's important for us as Christians to have goals so that when we get there, we know we've reached them. And Paul had a goal, and he'd reached it, and the eastern end of the Mediterranean was, in his view, established in provincial areas, and now he wanted to go west. So he's moving on. His final act in the east was to make a big collection for the poor in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem had had a famine by now, and they were desperately poor, and they were in a recession, a really serious recession. So Paul, as his last act, taught the churches he founded to learn to share what they'd got, and he made a collection of money for the poor believers in Jerusalem, and he took it to Jerusalem. So that was his final act, and he's got there 3 months, pause in Greece before he can take the money to Jerusalem. He's stuck in Greece. Presumably the weather is bad. He's got to wait for good weather to get his ship, and he's stuck in Greece for probably about 3 months. So he's got time to write, and he writes this long letter that during that 3 months, and people have said, is he trying to get this message into written form? Because he can't go on preaching forever, you know. When you get in your ministry, you begin to think, you know, I'm not going to be able to do this forever, so I must get into a video as I'm doing, or some permanent form. And for him, he had no video, so he had to get it into writing. That's what they say, and they say what he's doing is he's leaving a permanent record of his gospel, the gospel he preached, so that people will have a permanent reference to what Paul preached when he preached the gospel. And certainly it begins with, I am not ashamed of the gospel. And then he keeps talking about the gospel. So it could be that Paul's simply making a statement about his preaching, a last will and testament, his mature reflections, we might call it. He doesn't know how much longer he can travel or speak, and he's saying, this is my gospel, this is my manifesto, and this is what I want to stand for, a summary of his doctrine, if you like. There's another form of this theory, is that he's doing more than that. He's putting down in writing from the objections that he'd had over the years to his gospel and the answers to those objections, and people still publish books today, and they try to answer objections to the Christian faith and how to answer them. And one famous person you may know of is Josh McDowell. He's an outstanding example, I wanted to say, of someone who's published book after book on how to answer the questions people ask and the objections they make. And there's nothing wrong with being practiced. That's certainly wise. And so some people say it's not just a statement of his gospel, it's also a statement of the arguments that he's encountered as he's preached it. And Paul dialogued a great deal and had questions and answers. And the answers he gave to the objections that he received, they say that explains this letter. I don't think that's primarily the focus, because there are certain features of that that really call into question this theory. 3 questions in particular. Why just send this to Rome if it's the summary of his manifesto, his gospel? Why just send it to one church? Why not send it all around? But he didn't. The second big objection is that this is not Paul's gospel. Unfortunately, many Christians have made that mistake, and they've said it's not in the Romans, not part of the gospel. But there are a whole lot of things that are not here which are part of the gospel Paul preached. There isn't a single thing about the kingdom, yet we know Paul preached about the kingdom of God. There are other things not here, glaring omissions. There's nothing really about the resurrection of Jesus or his ascension, nothing about the church, nothing about communion. There's nothing about heaven or hell. There's nothing about repentance or even being born again. And that is almost a glaring absence of any mention of God being the Father. Perhaps you've never noticed these things, because once again, when you read, you should notice what's not there, but we tend to not do that. When you listen to a preacher, always notice what he doesn't preach about. That will tell you as much about that preacher as what he does tell you about. So these gaps tell us that this is not a summary of Paul's preaching. This is not the whole gospel. And those who build their gospel preaching on Paul's letter to the Romans are going to be deficient in a number of these areas. The third reason why I can't believe this is his manifesto is he's writing in that chapters 9, 10, and 11 don't fit either of these two things. Do you know that little bit in the middle, chapters 9, 10, and 11, where Paul lays bare his heart for the Jewish people and says, I want to tell you how I feel about them. He says, I'd go to hell if it would get them to heaven. Now, what's that all about? Well, that's nothing to do with the gospel he preaches, and unfortunately, scholars who tell us this is why he wrote always treat chapters 9, 10, and 11 as a parenthesis. It's not really part of it. Paul didn't divide this letter into chapters. He just wrote straight through. And there's a continuity which this theory does not notice. So when we look at the scriptures, we need to remember they were not written in chapters and verses. It says Romans 1 through 8 is one of their theories, is the gospel. 9, 10, and 11 are parentheses which he's just added, but they're not. Actually, they're really, truly the key to the whole letter. So let's look at the second theory. This theory starts with the relationship between the writer and the readers, between Paul and Rome, and says there must be a reason why Paul sent all of this to Rome. What was there about Rome that elicited this letter from Paul? And why did he write it before he went? And the two theories that are given are these. First of all, and of all cities, this was the most strategic, and Paul would want to have had a hand in the church in the capital of really the Gentile empire. So he wants to get in there and he wants to help the church, and that's fully understandable. We know the old adage, all roads lead to Rome, all roads pointed to Rome, and every road Paul had traveled, if he'd stayed on that road, would have taken him to Rome sooner or later, and that was clearly on his heart. I want to get into that strategic capital, into the metropolis, and really help establish the work of Christ. Well, I'm certain there's an element of truth in that, and it would mean that he's writing a letter of introduction to them or a self-revelation to them so that they could get to know him and get a recommendation to them. Instead of asking someone else to write to them on his behalf, he just simply writes on his own behalf. Paul wasn't above doing that, obviously. They may have heard that he was a controversial preacher, and that, I think, has some merit. He may have got that reaction many times. Well, you've given us something to think about, Paul. So, he's writing this letter to show them he's not a controversial preacher, that he preaches the gospel that they've already heard, and he's sending a sample sermon to them. Well, it's an interesting theory, but I don't think that fits the bill either yet. But it's one that could get us nearer to the truth. Rome for Paul would be the gateway to the west, to Spain. Now that he's evangelizing the eastern half of the Mediterranean and he wants to go west, he feels, I must have a new base that's nearer to my field. You see, Jerusalem was first base. Then Antioch was second, but Antioch's going to be an awful long way from Spain. So he's seeking a new base, and he's seeing them as the gateway to the West, and he only plans to visit them. He says, I'm not going to stay with you. I'm only visiting, and then I want you to send me on my way to Spain. So that is why he wrote, well, to get a new base for the western half of the Mediterranean? Possibly. Seeking their support and confidence? Possibly. But I don't think this explains what he's put in the letter. So let's go a little further. There may be elements of truth in these, don't get me wrong, but let me say straight away here, there's an element of truth in all this, but it's not the whole truth. But of these theories, some are assuming that Paul is trying to get something from the readers for himself. But in fact, I don't think he does that. He's wanting to give them something, not to get anything from them. He says, I want to minister to you. I want to come and give you another gift. There's a second reason this doesn't explain those funny chapters in the middle, 9, 10, and 11, where he's talking about Israel so much. Why should he mention that if he's just wanting their support for his missionary work in the West? Those chapters, which are a problem to all these theories, become actually the key down here. And the most important part of the letter, as we shall see, nor do those theories actually explain chapters 12 through 16, which are very practicable about how to live out the Christian life. And they deal with only 3 or 4 rather unusual problems. Why would Paul not give a general talk about Christian ethics and behavior? Why does he single out just 3 or 4 particular practical problems? Well, let's come now to approaching this letter from the point of view of Rome, or the readers in Rome. In other words, to say, what was the need in Rome for this letter? Not was Paul's idea for writing it or Paul's hope the result would be, but what was the situation in Rome that needed everything Paul says? Because then I feel we've got the key to unlock it. I think you'll agree. What was the situation? Well, the situation was both external and internal. The city of Rome is the external situation that comes through this letter again and again. If you read Romans 1, it reads like a Sunday newspaper published in the city of Rome. The things that are going on. For example, Romans 1 is one of the passages in the Bible that deals with homosexuality in both men and women. Now, why does it do that? Because Rome was an absolute hotbed of this, and there was something strangely relevant about that. Now, what was going on in Rome that was out of the first 15 Roman emperors? 14 of them were practicing gays. And if that was the emperor, you can imagine what the court was like. And of course, the whole metropolis, and Paul deals with a lot of the situation of Rome. It's a strangely modern ring to it. He deals with the outbreak of antisocial behavior, of children disobedient to parents, of people throwing away law and order, of uncontrollable violence and crime. It's a remarkable picture of the ancient capital city of the empire. And it was a pretty rough picture that we get in Romans chapter 1. Some problems that don't come up until later in the area reflect only too easily the political and social scene. For one thing, everybody was into tax evasion in Rome. You couldn't get the poll tax collected. By the way, you and I realize there's nothing new about poll taxes. You realize Jesus would not have been born in Bethlehem if it were not for a poll tax. But we should just have a little Christian attitude to these things that rather changes the feel. And that's how the Savior came to be born in Bethlehem, because of the poll tax. And that wasn't suddenly thought up. So it can be good But you can see they had a real problem collecting it, and everybody was into moonlighting and, fiddling with your tax returns. And there in Romans chapter 13, we see Paul say, now you Christians pay your taxes, you see. So he's staying right in lockstep with the governmental viewpoint. He's not contrary to that. So when you read through Romans, there's a real reflection of the political and social scene in the city of Rome at that time. So Paul's trying to meet their needs in that environment, trying to help them see that environment. He's ministering to them already before he's got there. And I think the reason he tried to do this, or to do it, was because he wasn't sure whether he'd get there. You see, he knew he was going to be arrested and put on trial. The Holy Spirit had revealed that to him already. As you remember, Agabus in Jerusalem was a prophet. So he says right up, I'm going to preach before I get there, and he seeks to match his words to their situation in this city of vice and crime and lawlessness. And he says the gospel is the answer to the situation. He said, I'm not ashamed of it. Well, I think he sent it on ahead because of Rome, and his message there is, don't let the sea get into the lifeboat, because the lifeboat's going to sink. If you get the sea into the lifeboat, you're in trouble. The church must be in the world, but when the world gets into the church, it sinks. You can't save everybody when it's sinking. And there's a real thread running through the letter, ministering to Christians who have to live in this city riddled with vice and crime and violence. And it's a message for us too. But I don't think we've reached the heart of it even yet. I think the real reason he wrote was internal to the church, not to the state of the city of Rome, but to the state of the church. And we know enough about the history of Rome to understand the church in Rome was exactly what that problem was. There was a crisis, and there was a problem, and this is what it was and how it arose. Now, I want to just give you a little cultural background. It's estimated that 80% of the Roman Empire was populated by slaves. So a lot of these people were not literate. But what we're seeing here is people who would get an epistle, a letter from Paul, and it would be read to them. And we must realize the Christians taught the slaves and the illiterate how to read, and that's very important. Now, we don't know who founded the church in Rome, as I said. I haven't got a clue, and I can't tell you, and I don't know that there's anyone in history that can tell us. I do know that we see certainly certain things. One of my favorite movies is The Robe, and the centurion who took the robe that Jesus Christ wore, took it back to Pilate, presumably according to history. And so the Praetorian Guard, the elite guards to the Caesar himself would have been affected. And we see a lot of those people greeted in the book. So back to their home in Rome, because there was a colony or a ghetto, unfortunately, a ghetto of some 40,000 Jews, it's estimated, in Rome at that time. Already they were scattered Jews all around the Mediterranean, and 40,000 of them in the city, and no doubt the first Roman church was Jewish and began in that ghetto with Hebrew believers in Jesus, filled with the Holy Spirit. And so for the first chapter in its life, the church was entirely Jewish, and it grew and no doubt was fostered by evangelism among Jewish merchants and traders who were always coming in and out of the city. Now then, came an emperor called Claudius. Now Claudius was anti-Jewish, and he watched them, the Jews, to find out an excuse to throw them out of Rome. And he says there was a disturbance among the Jews over a person called Chrestus. Chrestus. And I think that could easily be Christus, but he didn't quite get it right. And I think it was, and there was a riot in the Jewish ghetto between Chrestus followers and the Jews. Now that's what happened everywhere where Paul went. The Jews were the real enemies of the gospel, and therefore in Rome, now in the Jewish ghetto, there's a riot about the followers of Christus or Christus. And Claudius says, out, all you Jews out, you can't live in peace among yourselves. I won't have you living in Rome. And 40,000 Jews had to leave Rome, and the Jews were expelled. Among them, remember, was a Jewish couple that we see called Aquila and Priscilla. And those names hopefully strike a chord with you. And we saw that in Acts chapter 18. It says that Paul met up with Aquila and Priscilla in Corinth in Greece because they'd been turned out of Rome by Claudius. So all this hangs together historically. But by this time, the Christian church in Rome had a few Gentile members, and suddenly the church in Rome shrank from a large Jewish church to a small Gentile one. And then, of course, it grew. And those Gentiles evangelized more Gentiles. So now we have, instead of an almost entirely Jewish church in Rome, an almost entirely Gentile church. And then the Emperor Claudius died. And the next emperor said, hey, all you Jews can come back. You're good for business, which is true. And he wasn't the last ruler to invite Jews in to help the financial situation. And all the Jews came flooding back, including the Jewish believers. Oh, but now the Gentiles were running the church. Now you begin to sense the crisis. The Jewish believers have come back, and lo and behold, they're not very welcome. And the Gentile believers are now in charge. It's happened before, and it's happened since, and I'm afraid it'll go on happening. And people have to leave, and they come back, and they try to integrate again. And it's not easy to reintegrate into a fellowship, as some of you know, is it? Maybe some of you have experienced that. Well, that was the problem, and now there was tension between the Jewish and Gentile believers inside this church in Rome. Now, I believe we've got the key that opens Romans for you, historically. Everything Paul says is to get those two groups back into one fellowship. And when you look through the letter, you find that almost every part of it is dealing with that situation. He talks about sin first. He talks about the sin in the city of Rome. And then he says, now you. And he says, Gentiles are sinners. Jews are sinners. And let's begin right there. You're all equal sinners before God. Jews are no better than Gentiles. Gentiles are no better than the Jews. You're all sinners. And then he moves on to justification, that beautiful thing. How we get right with God. And he says, we're all justified by faith, whether we're Jews or Gentiles. And as he goes through the letter, he's always saying Jews and Gentiles are the same. We're sinners, the same. We need to be saved, the same. We're headed for the same heaven. We're saved by the same blood. Why are you arguing as to who is more important? Who was first here? Who's more important than the other in God's sight? Then in chapters 6 and 7, he deals with the two peculiar problems that the Gentiles have with the gospel and that Jews have with the gospel. And we have our old friends, my dears, legalism and license. And Gentiles were prone to go into license, and Jews were prone to go into legalism. So, in chapter 6, he deals with license. We don't have a license to sin. He tells them, don't you realize when you were baptized, you were finished with sin. It has no more dominion over you. But in chapter 7, he tries to deal with legalism, and he talks about his own past. He said, I tried to keep the law, but I couldn't keep the 10th law on coveting. And he said, you can't keep the law. So he's dealing with the license of the Gentiles and the legalism of the Jews. And we'll see that time and again. And then he says in chapter 8, now I'm going to talk about the liberty of the Spirit. So we've got Galatians here all over again in these 3 chapters. He's dealing with Jew and Gentile. He's saying, you both got problems. You're both sinners. You're both justified by faith, and you both got problems with the gospel. You Gentiles are going into license. See, shall we sin that grace shall abound? You Jews are going back into legalism. And he said, you may serve the law of God with your mind, but you'll find another law within your members that serves the law of sin. And you finish up by saying, the good I want to do, I can't do, and the evil I don't want to do, I do. That's where legalism leaves you, my friends, in utter frustration and despair. Wretched man that I am, as he said. What we need is the liberty of the Spirit that unties and unites Jew and Gentile together. And then he comes to chapters 9, 10, and 11, which are so crucial, to the whole letter. You see, Gentiles are prone to think like this, and sadly we still do, and the majority of churches around the world think like this. We are the new Israel. We have replaced the Jewish people. They're out of God's purpose, and we're in. And that, the whole chapters 9, 10, 11 are to deal with that tension between Jew and Gentile. It's still having to be dealt with today. 9, 10, and 11 must be preached today because the churches of this country and in this world are into what's known as replacement theology, which is that God has washed his hands of the Jewish people and the church is now Israel. My friends, that is not true. The name Israel is never given to the church in the New Testament. And Paul has to say, do you think God is finished with the Jews just because they rejected him? Do you think he's rejected them? Never. And that's the whole section. 9, 10, and 11 becomes the key to the book and the key to the relationships between Gentile and Jew. And he says this, we're up against this old question that I've raised earlier. He says, now you Gentiles, don't be proud because the Jews were cut off and you're grafted in. You too will be cut out if you don't continue in God's kindness. You too will be cut out if you don't continue in God's strong word. Christians, you'll be cut off unless you continue and continue God's kindness. So you don't boast over the Jews. He says, I'll tell you a big secret. One day all of Israel will be saved. He says, one day they will come together and will both finish. And I think that's a beautiful thing. They're going to be right back in, and Jew and Gentile will be one olive tree, and the olive tree is the symbol for Israel, right? Now you see how these chapters 9, 10, 11 become the key to open up this whole beautiful epistle, this 7,000 plus word epistle. It's all about their internal problem of the Jewish church having been banished, the Gentiles coming back in, and now these two groups can't get on with each other. And they're saying, we're better than you. The Jews are saying, we were first. And the Gentiles are saying, but you've been cut off and we replaced you. And Paul says, no, no, no. We will all call it a halt there. So join me next time for part 2 as I finish the summary, I hope, the keys that will unlock the epistle of the book of Romans to you. So have a blessed day, and thanks for watching.